What led you to identify as a Provisionist? So you were at one point a Calvinist. Maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, when I went off to college at the age 18, 19-ish, I was introduced by a mentor who's still a good friend of mine, by the way, still a lovely man that I absolutely adore. But he introduced me to John MacArthur and John Piper, and my dad was actually good friends with Louis Giglio, who's also a well-known Calvinist that actually brought John Piper into the mainstream. And so there was some connections there with those folks. And once I was introduced to Calvinistic theology, I kind of just bought into it hook, line, and sinker and thought, why doesn't everybody believe this? Why haven't I been taught this my whole life? And so I kind of became one of those cage stage kind of Calvinists trying to convince other people to become a Calvinist, and became pretty good at convincing quite a few of my friends and a lot of the people that I led at my church to becoming Calvinists. And so I held to Calvinistic theology all the way through my seminary and into my ministry pretty much my entire 20s, from age 19 all the way up to about 29, 30-ish, about a decade of my life. I was a 5-point, would have considered myself a 5-point Calvinist, very much in line with what I heard from MacArthur. R.C. Sproul, I got the Ligonier tapes, the cassette tapes in the mail, and I listened to them religiously. I loved R.C. Sproul and his teachings. And again, Piper was a big influence on me as well. Loved the conferences. I had him come to our conferences that I was heading up whenever I became a part of the Texas Baptist. At that time, I was starting to doubt my Calvinism, but I still loved Piper enough to have him come and be a part of the ministry. Vody Baucham, same thing. He would come to speak at our students at Super Summer in the YC, and loved Vody, still love Vody, still think he's a great preacher. People don't think I can still be friendly and friends with guys that I disagree with. I went to school with Matt Chandler. I sat in the student center along with Chris and some of the other guys trying to convince him of the limited atonement because he wasn't convinced of it yet. Matt Chandler is another one of those guys that's kind of big in that Reformed Calvinistic movement of today that was a part of my growing up in history and such. I was reading a book by A.W. Tozer. I think it was The Knowledge of the Holy, if I'm not mistaken. And he just said something that didn't really fit my Calvinistic paradigm. And I thought A.W. Tozer was a Calvinist because John Piper quoted from him so often. I just assumed he was one of us. I kind of had this mindset that if somebody's a serious scholar and a good biblical teacher, he had to be a Calvinist, and so it shocked me a little bit to hear Tozer say something that seemed so out of line with Calvinism. And I began to research a little bit and found out that he actually had several sermons and writings against Calvinistic theology. And so that kind of sparked within me this little bit of, how is that possible? This smart guy I've had so much respect for, and I love his stuff. And then all of a sudden I find out he doesn't fit in my camp. And the same thing with C.S. Lewis. It was one of those things I kind of thought he was one of ours, and then later found out he was not. And then that kind of made me go, how can smart guys like this that I respect so much reject something that seems so blatantly obvious in the scripture? And that kind of led me on a journey. I had debated back in high school and college. And so I had kind of learned the skill of taking on both sides of an issue, which you had to do in debate. You do cross-exam. You have to be able to, you walk in the room, you don't know which side you're going to defend yet. You have to be ready to defend both. I kind of took that skill that I'd learned and said, you know what, I want to learn what the other side really thinks so that I can become better at defending what I believe was biblical Christianity, my doctrines of grace, Calvinism. But it ended up leading me out of Calvinism, to my surprise, and against all resistance too, because I really did not want to leave Calvinism. And matter of fact, even after I left Calvinism and started doubting it for a long time, I kept that kind of secret because a lot of my friends were Calvinistic, and I kind of liked being a part of that cool crowd. I kind of kept it secret for 2 or 3, 4 years before I kind of started talking about it. And then eventually ended up writing my dissertation on it when I went back to school. There's at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. I went back to get my doctorate, and I wrote my dissertation on that topic. So,
but you weren't actually a Calvinist. You weren't a true Calvinist, right?
Well, that's apparently what people think. Once saved, always saved is the same as once a Calvinist, always a Calvinist, I suppose. And if you ever leave Calvinism, you must not have really understood it, or you really believed it. And that's a big accusation. You never understood Calvinism. You obviously never understood what it is. And I can't tell many people how many times I've explained. I might not have been the same kind of Calvinist you are. You may be right. I wasn't that well informed in my 20s about all the different nuances of the different Calvinistic views and beliefs. You can make your claims all you want to, but Calvinism isn't a monolithic group. And the Southern Baptist type of Calvinists, the J.D. Greers that are the 3.5 pointers, and these kinds of guys, I might have been more in line with that kind of a Calvinist in a lot of ways, because it's kind of a quasi, buffet Calvinist. You take the parts you like and you kind of leave the parts that you don't like on the side. There was some of that probably going on, things that I hadn't grappled with because I hadn't thought through the implications of some of the claims that I had held to. It's just irrelevant, though. I mean, most Calvinists talk about how they were used to be Arminians and how they used to hold to free will theology, and almost all of them that I've heard talk about that. R.C. Sproul, Piper, MacArthur, all of them talk about how they used to hold to a different belief, and then they became Calvinist, and that God drug them kicking and screaming, as Sproul puts it, into these doctrines of grace. For me to be the opposite and to say the opposite is not that controversial.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's any reason for people to doubt that I really did believe those claims of the systematic when I did. But some people can't stand someone leaving their precious views behind, I guess.